Welcome to Creative Vision, Visiting the Art Makers, a show about art and artists in the community. We're very fortunate today to be spending time with a wonderful creative personality. She's 5'3" and she's so powerful and so creative. Let's meet Hilda Thorpe. Hilda, tell me about how you got started in the arts.
I got started at a pretty late date. I was actually 35 years old. My children then were old enough to take care of themselves somewhat. They were 12, 10, and 7. I have 2 sons and a daughter. And since they were at school, I was free, and I'd always had the responsibility of contributing somewhat to my household, so I always had part-time jobs. And I had never really done something totally for myself. So at that point, I thought, well, this is it. And art was very important in my life. So I started taking classes at American U and took drawing, painting, and sculpture for 4 years. I was not working for a degree, but just studio courses. And almost immediately afterwards, I began showing. And that's pretty much how I got started. And then it became a way of life for me. Since then, and even while I was at school, I always had a studio. I had a studio in a greenhouse, in an estate nearby, in a stable, in a country house that was run by the Methodists off the Parkway in Alexandria. Finally, I got to my studio here in Alexandria, and I've been here since the 60s, which is pretty amazing. And since that time, I've been a very dedicated artist and pretty well disciplined. I come here almost every day, and hopefully, I'm working at something. If not, I'm in my environment and thinking about it. So that's pretty much in a nutshell.
The studio is in Old Town Alexandria on a 3rd floor, right off of King Street. How did you come to find this wonderful, beautiful space?
It's really a great story. At that time, in the 60s, this was kind of no man's land. It didn't really get popular and a tourist haven until 1976 during the bicentennial. And then the government gave a great deal of money to put bricks on the sidewalks and artificial gas lights up and down the street. And it became very popular. Well, at that time, this building was empty. It had been occupied by the Air Force Photographic Unit. And before that, of course, during the Civil War, it was a Civil War hospital. So it's quite a famous old building. And I had been looking for space as an artist, and I couldn't afford very much. I could afford $25 a month. So nobody was interested in giving me any space because most of the buildings on the 100 block were empty. They didn't have electricity or heat. They had been occupied by grain shops and things of that sort, saddle shops. And somebody said, well, the bank president of Burke and Herbert owns this building on the corner of King and Lee. Why don't you go and see him? So I went to see Taylor Burke. He was a very interesting man. He collected old cars, and he went to his office every day with a parrot on his shoulder. And he was sort of my type of guy. So I explained my situation and said, I understand you own that building on the corner of King and Lee, and I wondered if I might have some studio space there, but I can't afford much money, maybe $25 a month. So he said, very unlike a bank president, well, let's go down and look at it. So we walked down the street, he opened up all the doors, we went through the 3 floors of the building. He said, well, I don't see why you can't use it, but I'm thinking of selling it at some point. I said, well, that's great. And he didn't want anything for it. I said, well, maybe I can give you a painting or something in exchange. He says, no, I'm not into that kind of stuff. And so that's how I got the space. And at that point, I would work on all floors. And then eventually the shop down below called the Why Not Shop, people bought the building. At that time, I think they paid maybe $72,000 for it. And of course, Taylor Burke, the bank president, made $5,000 on it. He thought he was really doing beautifully, Now, of course, the building is worth millions. And no, I don't own any of it. I rent my space. So that's pretty much the story of how I got this building. And I've been very lucky to be in it all this time. And, you know, I have about 2,000 square feet of space and 10-foot high ceilings and
Wonderful light.
good light. And it's wonderful to be here in Old Town Alexandria. I feel safe, and I'm never lonely, but looking out of the window and seeing all the people. And yet I'm private, you know. It's not open to the public.
If you had to describe your style, how would you?
I've always felt that space was very important. And I know with my students, I recommend that they get out of the cellar, get out of small space, and open up, because it reflects in your work. Where you are reflects what you do. So because I have this big space, I feel I can work big, I can expand. And I think that spirit pervades all my work, and I don't believe that I could do what I do in other kinds of space. So I think big in terms of where I am and what is possible.
You paint, you do sculpture work, you assemble glass and paper and mobiles, you've done photography, you do a little bit of everything.
Perhaps I do, but I think at the same time there is a unifying factor in all of it, which has to do with the way I approach it, and that innately it has to do with nature. I'm very close to nature. Even though I'm in the middle of the city here, I live by the river. I walk by the river every morning. I have a sailboat and I sail along the bay. So I'm very close to the sky. I'm very close to water. I'm close to mist and trees. And I think that kind of experience is reflected in my work.
Is that what you gain your inspiration from, is nature and being outside?
I think so. It's not deliberate, but it seems to come out in my work. It always has a feeling that somehow it emanated from the world around me.
Let's talk about some individual pieces. The floating clouds. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that grew. It grew from small pieces that I made. I make my paper. It's made of macerated cotton and hemp. And I formed the sheets on a tabletop into shapes, and then sponge off the water and let the paper dry. And then when it has maintained its integrity, I then wet it down again, and I use acrylic paints, very much like watercolors, so that the pigments seep through both sides of the paper. And it's always a process of discovery for me. And with the paper, what happened was the pigment kind of crawls to the edge of the paper as it's drying, because it's very wet, and that resulted in a very decisive, interesting edge that's concentrated with color. So that was a factor in what was seen and what I discovered in the painting of the pieces. Then when the paper is dry, the paint is dry, the work is coated with a resin with acrylic medium, and that allows me to shape it without breaking the paper, and also makes the things more durable, waterproof or dustproof. And at first they were like bas-reliefs on the wall, and some of the work still is like that. And then they began to be more three-dimensional, and eventually got suspended in space, and that meant that they could float a little bit, and that you could be very much a part of it, or it could be very much a part of the space high up and around you, above you. And depending on how you hang them, they can float around. And so that's pretty much how they came to be. And I think of these things as floating paintings because it's not only a shape, it has to do with color. And it's very much like my paintings. It's spontaneous. What happens, you might say, is accidental, born of 30 years of experience. So that's pretty much about what I can say about those.
When you approach your canvases, how do you start off?
Well, that's difficult because I might start with something, a color, a swath of paint, a gesture that leads to another gesture, and it builds up depending on my energy and the mood and whether the paint is behaving. And it grows. It changes hour by hour, and it changes day by day. If I come the next day and look at it, it speaks to me in terms of what is possible. And sometimes, I get to a point where I have to stop because there's nothing more I can do. And so some time will elapse, and then suddenly I know that this has to be done. So it's an evolving process. It isn't something I know ahead of time. And maybe that's the part that's really intriguing, that there's a sense of discovery in the doing. So I can't answer that. I might start out with a warm painting of, yellow, oranges, or soft colors, and end up with a pretty raucous one. They tend to be free and with a lot of energy, and at the same time, I think, rather spiritual in feeling, and though at times somewhat feminine, so I think with a strength that speaks of the energy that goes into it.
I see that some of your canvases are as small as 2 inches by 2 inches to about 10 feet by 10 feet.
Actually, the largest painting I did was 20 feet. And it was a commission for IBM. And I had 2 stretchers made because I was sure that maybe the first one would work, but it did. So I have worked large, 20 feet, 13 feet. 13 feet was for the Marriott Hotel. I've done 10-foot paintings. Right now my paintings are like 5 by 6 feet. Or there is a triptych that measures 18 feet across. So I tend to work big. I feel freer working big. But then there are times when a tiny little thing will have the impact that a large thing has. But it's working in between that doesn't really appeal to me too much.
When you had a show at the Corcoran, you laid out homemade paper that stretched about 100 feet. Is that true?
Well, there was a group show, a sculpture group show, and I had 4 hanging pieces in an installation over the atrium space. They measured 40 feet in length by 9 feet wide, and there were 4 such panels, so 36 feet across and 40 feet the other way.
And how tall are you?
Well, I couldn't hold them up. I am 5 foot, maybe 3 inches, but I worked on my studio floor, and I had a couple of assistants help me then. So that's how that came about. They're still rolled up upstairs. I was working big.
Hilda, I understand that you also have a teaching group that you work with every Wednesday, and some of these students have been with you 20 to 30 years. Tell me a little bit about this.
Oh, well, not quite that long, but teaching was a surprise part of my life because I really was not geared for that or trained for that. But when I left American University and felt, I didn't have to take any more classes, I was asked to teach at Mount Vernon Seminary and Junior College. And so I taught there for quite a few years, and then American University asked me to come and teach, and I taught sculpture for 10 years at American University. When I stopped teaching there, I found there were a lot of graduate students who were at loose ends. They were artists who were not showing, who were not certain about their work, and needed input into their lives. And a group organized itself, really, and came to the studio once a month, and we discussed their work, we discussed what was happening in town, we talked about where they might go with their work, whether they wanted to show, what value it had, what importance they should put into critiquing or outside critiques. And that was very valuable because mostly these people are isolated and uncertain, and they have spouses to deal with who support them and who are not particularly sympathetic to their spending money and not making money. So all those issues we talked about men and women, though we didn't have too many men. So that's how the teaching got started in my studio. And I've had several groups like that, and when they got to a point of maturation, I would say, that they'd begin to show, feel good about their work, they could work on their own, we would stop that group. But now I'm teaching drawing, which is a result of these trips that I do with my colleague, Françoise Johalem. We take a group of people who are interested in learning how to do a sketchbook journal on various trips. And we've been to France and Egypt, and Guatemala, Portugal, Spain, Morocco. And from that group, as a nucleus, we started a drawing class at night. So every Wednesday from 7 to 9, I have a group of people come and we draw, either from the model, or we've been all over Alexandria and using the places there model. We've been to a jazz group across the street, or the bookstore down the way, parked ourselves there for 2 hours. We've been to a local restaurant when we needed air conditioning, and my studio is not air conditioned, and spent 2 hours there drawing the people serving food and the people eating food. And that's been a very rewarding experience, not only for my students, but for me.
You feel that you've grown as an artist by being also a teacher?
I always learn from everything, yes. Yes, I can get some inspiration from my people. And it's a group of people that range from beginners to established artists, and everybody learns from each other.
Tell me about your oil paintings and your acrylic paintings. How do they differ?
Well, for years I worked in oil, and I felt the use of turpentine might be a little hazardous, and so in the 70s, and I started seriously painting in the early 60s, I guess acrylics came into being, and I started working with acrylics. Well, recently I found that I was tearing in the eyes, and I wondered whether I was becoming sensitive to acrylic. And so I decided to go back to oil, because they now had turpentine that didn't smell, though I'm sure you're still inhaling the fumes. So I started to paint in oil. Actually, the oil is a little bit more fluid, but I think if you look at my paintings, you'd be hard-pressed to tell whether I used acrylic or oil because of the way I paint. I paint in a very painterly fashion.
Well, tell me about how you go about painting. You take the canvas and you staple it up on the wall?
I staple my canvas on the wall. And I have worked on unsized canvas with acrylics, but you can't do that with oil. So I now gesso the canvas in 2 or 3 coatings, and when that is through, I start to paint. I apply just large areas of paint and just let it happen. And that's, you might say that's an underpainting, though I don't think of it as an underpainting. It's just a phase of painting. And then it keeps building, and sometimes getting more intense, sometimes finding things, sometimes losing things. That's pretty much the way I go, until the painting says, hey, this is it, don't touch me.
Tell me about some of the places that you've exhibit or have your artwork shown.
Well, I've had a lot of shows. I don't know, maybe 30, 40. In-person shows and group shows. In my large show, and most meaningful, was at the Phillips Collection in 1975, and it was a time when they were very generous with their space. I think it's harder to do that now. I had almost the whole second floor, the large exhibition room, the passway leading from the old building to the new one and the new room, plus a stairwell going downstairs. And it was pretty exciting because they took down Picasso's from the hallway and put my little 3-dimensional pieces there. And in the big exhibition room, we took down a big Kandinsky show. And of course, those days, everybody helped. All the so-called guards, and I helped, and it was less formal than it is now. Now, if you approach a painting, it screams, it goes, ee! But then we didn't have those kind of things. So that was mostly painted canvas sculpture, plus some oil pastel, large 40 by 60 inch drawings, and then small three-dimensional works. And then I've shown in a number of galleries around town over the years. Franz Bader, Addison Ripley, Barbara Fiedler. I first started with the first serious gallery in Washington called Jefferson Place Gallery. At that point in the 60s, that was the only gallery in town, except for Franz Bader, which was then part of a bookstore. Now, of course, there are hundreds of galleries. But that wasn't so long ago.
Not at all. Let's see.
So I've used my studio primarily as a working place. I've had, various soirees here just for the fun of it, and exhibited also here. But the serious exhibiting has been in Washington, and right now I'm exhibiting at Gallery K. That's my gallery, and I've had a show there in June, and I've been represented in group shows there.
Well, if you've been painting and doing sculpture for about 40 years, how many pieces do you think you've actually done in your lifetime?
I don't know, hundreds. Actually, I studied in the late 50s and started seriously, professionally, I would say, in the early 60s.
I've been in the back room, and I've seen your library of research and your slides of your inventories, and there's maybe about 30 books, and you keep wonderful records. What type of advice would you give a beginning artist who is just starting off?
I think it's very important to keep records. Though I look well organized, I'm really not. Because it's very hard to do everything you have to do. I think that if you're a serious artist, you really need a secretary, an archivist, an assistant to keep everything going. You also need a photographer. And to do that by yourself is mind-boggling. And I've tried pretty much to handle it. Every now and then I have an intern from Madeira School, and I have a photographer friend who helps with that. But it's very hard to keep good records. I would say start out with good habits. When you do something you like, photograph it, document it. If you sell it, make sure you put down on your collector's list who it is and what it is and when you sold it and how much they paid for it, because 10 years later somebody's going to call you up and say, can you reevaluate this painting, bring it up to date? So those are all things to do and to start off, with good intentions.
Do you ever sell a painting that's very precious to you and wish that you've kept it?
Unfortunately, yes. And it's hard to sell paintings because you think, well, you should really keep this. But then you've got so much, and you do need to pay your rent. So it's a necessary evil to sell. And some of the best paintings I no longer have, but they exist in somebody else's space, so that's good.
Okay. Hilda, tell me a little bit about your travel sketches and how that relates to your work.
As you've seen, I have a lot of sketchbooks. I don't know, maybe 100 or more. And when I'm traveling with a group, I'm in the role of teacher, of course. But I also keep a sketchbook, which is a good sample of what could be done by all the students. Though some of them are better than I am and more inventive. But that experience, I have found, feeds me in the studio, not literally, but certainly spiritually and artistically, aesthetically. So it's a jumping off place. And I've done some small works, as you've seen, that definitely emanate from the sketchbook or from memory, triggered by the sketchbook, and maybe by photographs also. It's the first time I've done that. Usually I just continue with large abstract paintings. But I think even the abstract paintings in color and spirit reflect where I was. But recently there is a body of work that comes out of the sketching and the memory, things from Morocco. And in the Morocco book, that resulted in some watercolor works combined, collaged with handmade paper, which I then contributed or donated to the little Moroccan city called Asila. And that was a catalyst for the ambassador from Morocco sending me to Asila. And I was a guest for a couple of weeks there and did a lot of sketching, was totally by myself except for participating somewhat in their symposium, which had essentially to do with how Americans see Arabs and how Arabs view Americans. And it was a very interesting time. So the travel does fill my life aesthetically as well as emotionally.
I saw in the Morocco group you had some watercolors of figures as well as doorways and windows. Tell me a little bit more about that group.
Well, actually, where I was staying, which was near this little village, walled-in, ancient, beautiful, all-white village, every morning, peasants or village people would traipse down the hillside on this dirt road to go to the village to work or sell their wares on donkeys or on foot, wearing the most colorful clothes or rags or whatever it is they were wearing. And I just sat on the ground there, and as they passed me, I'd do quick sketches and watercolors and ink. And those resulted in a number of works which you've seen here in larger size watercolors.
Hilda, where do you see yourself going with your art?
Well, that's difficult to answer. But I find it's an interesting time of my life. Contrary to what you think, as you get older, you would get slower or repetitive or stop working. I think as an artist, that's not true, that you get stronger and more daring in your work. And I think as you get older, you also feel like you can do it. You know, there's nothing to lose. And so I find myself freer and more able to try something new. So I feel my paintings are loosening up, are developing in a different way, less control, and more relying on experiential things. So I think that I'm in a better place than I was earlier. So I would say that age is in your favor as an artist. I can't tell you where I'm going. That, like the painting, I guess, will evolve by itself. Spent with Hilda Thorpe has been very special to me. She's a wonderful artist and a good friend. And we appreciate her sharing her studio and her artwork with us. Join us next time when Creative Vision visits the art makers in the community. This is Barbara Januszkiewicz signing off.